Good morning, everybody. Again, my name is Debbie Kazan. I am a partner in the Construction and Government Contracts Group at Alston & Bird, and we would like to welcome everybody to our Diversity and Inclusion program regarding the construction industry today. We have a great program planned for you. We're very excited, and we'd like to take the time to thank you all for arranging your schedule to participate in this important program. Obviously, the topic of diversity and inclusion is not a new one in the construction program, but certainly there is a much more focused effort by companies and individuals in companies to further these efforts in their everyday operations. And so we hope that this program can help everybody continue to do that within their companies. I looked at the attendee list, and we have a lot of decision makers who are participating this morning. And I think that speaks volume to how important diversity and inclusion is and is continuing to become in the construction industry. And so all of you decision makers are also going to be hearing from a lot of construction industry leaders that we have lined up today to tell you about how their companies are furthering their diversity and inclusion goals. So we hope today can be a great collaborative learning process, and we're really excited and thankful for everybody to be here. And now I'm going to pass the baton over to my partner, John Hanover.
Thank you, Debbie, and thank you, Debbie, for all your hard work in putting this program together. And thank you, everyone, for attending. I agree. I think this is a critical program for our time, and it has really allowed us to focus on some of the issues that are of the utmost importance. We have put together, I think, industry leaders who can speak to these issues, both from their company perspective, from the organizational perspective. A really great program that's allowing people to enter the construction industry, and our panel discussion, which I think will be really informative and helpful to everyone. So I do appreciate all the hard work that everyone's put in to make this program a success. And I look forward to spending the day with everyone, and I hope very much that you enjoy it. Before we begin, I do have a few announcements that are somewhat critical to the organization of the day. First, the program is being recorded for internal purposes, and I'm required to say this because if you're listening to the recorded format, please note that numbers and information that's reported during the program may have changed as time passes from this day of November 10th, 2020. Please keep that in mind. Second, if you have questions during the program, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. We do encourage questions. We will try to answer all the questions that we receive during the program. We will have Q&A at the end of each session. So please use the Q&A box to do that. Please know also that we will send the slides to everyone that are used in this session within a couple of days after the program completes. Third, with regard to CLE credit, there is CLE credit for this hour of labor and employment discussion. If you haven't already provided your state bar or state registration number, please do that now by using the Q&A box, the Q&A button. And in particular, if you are in the jurisdiction of New York or Virginia and requesting CLE credit, please download the affirmation form that is located in the seminar confirmation email that you would have received when you registered. You will have to enter the codes that will appear during the presentation. After the completion of the program, please either email or fax that form back to us with the contact information that was provided to you in the confirmation email. If you're requesting CLE from other states, you're not required to do that. Also, as you know, there are 3 sessions to today's program. This is the first. There are 3 different links to each session in the confirmation email that you received. So please, after the breaks, use the second and the third confirmation link that you received to join the other sessions. As I said, this is the labor and employment section. that we are lucky enough to hear from two of our partners, Alex Barnett and Jim Evans, about labor and employment in the construction industry. We also have, following this session, which would be at 1:30 Eastern Standard Time, a discussion by the Associated General Contractors and a program called Construction Ready that you'll really be interested in hearing about. So I hope you will join us for that program. And then from 2:30 to 4 is the panel discussion with in-house counsel from Lynn-Lease, Turner, Suffolk Construction, and representatives from CIM Development and H.J. Russell, and a panel being moderated by Angela Payne-James, who is the diversity and inclusion partner at Alston & Bird. So I hope you will join us for that. Now, back to session one, Debbie, and introductions of our speakers.
So I'd like to introduce Alex Barnett, who is a partner at Alston & Bird in the Labor and Employment Group, as John mentioned. She represents employers in a wide variety of labor and employment matters. She counsels and defends employers in actions brought under state and common law and federal law. Her practice also includes defending employers in complex employment class actions, including internal investigations and advising on employment-related issues arising in corporate transactions. Additionally, Alex routinely counsels clients in a variety of industries on employment actions, policies, and practices. She also has been selected as a Georgia Lawyers Rising Star List for several years now. And she did her undergrad at Dartmouth and got her law degree at University of Virginia Law School. So thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Debbie.
Hang on one second, Alex. I'm going to introduce Jim, and then we're going to start with the program. Jim is also joining us today from Los Angeles. Jim has more than 30 years of experience practicing labor and employment law, as well as commercial litigation, including class actions involving wage and hour violations, employee misclassifications, unfair competition, and validity of advertising marketing claims, and violations of the ADA, just to name a few. Jim is a highly skilled trial lawyer, having decades of experience handling complex cases, both in state and federal courts. Jim also is an expert in negotiation and dispute resolution and mediation and arbitration and other forms of dispute resolution. Jim's been recognized by the LA Daily Journal and the State Bar of California for his pro bono efforts. He also currently serves as the practice group diversity partner for labor employment within Alston & Bird. Jim's a graduate of USC and went to University of California, Berkeley Law School. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex and Jim.
Thank you, Debbie and John, for that introduction. I am Alex. I'm an attorney in Atlanta in the Labor and Employment Group, and I'm thrilled to be here today to discuss this topic with all of you. Diversity and inclusion is something that has been of interest to me since the time I was in college. And when I interned in the diversity and inclusion department at an investment bank in New York City in college, this has been something that I have also been interested in at the law firm, where I'm a member of the Atlanta Diversity Committee. So I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Jim, who will get us started on our topic today. Thank you so much for being here.
Trying to figure out this unmute thing, so forgive me. I'm Jim Evans. Good morning to everybody. I'm a partner in our labor and employment practice group, and I have the privilege of serving as the practice group's diversity partner. My role is to assist in the practice group's efforts to hire, retain, and promote attorneys of diverse backgrounds. And my role has me interacting with our diverse attorneys to ensure that each is getting the opportunities that they want and seek. My role is to remove obstacles to opportunities and in turn remove obstacles to promotion of our young attorneys. To understand the experience each needs and to take steps to help them get that experience, I talk to them. If folks don't feel that they have opportunities, we know a certainty they will move on. And there are some practical considerations here when people leave a job because they feel that they aren't getting the opportunity to sit at the game courtside. The departure of employees who are performing well but feel they aren't getting the opportunities they want adversely affects project staffing. And I know I speak the obvious in saying that. It adversely affects client relationships. It's expensive. And at a personal level, it's disappointing. As a trial attorney, I've learned that it's critical that I understand the depths of the human experience. How else can I understand how a juror may see my case, my client, or the evidence? But my perspective is limited by my own experiences, my own biases, and my own prejudices. Yet, these are informed and enlightened by understanding the life experiences of others. Why is diversity and inclusion important to me? It enhances joy in the workplace. Joy creates productivity. And for me, at least, it's a fundamental matter of fairness. Folks created opportunities for me. I became a partner at my firm, and it was good for me, and it was good for my firm. Diversity and inclusion enhances the diversity of perspectives on projects and things that we do together collectively in the workplace. And opportunity creates a better workplace. It creates happier and more productive workers. And more productive workers enhance firm performance. For each of the past 15 years, Alston & Bird has been ranked by Fortune magazine as one of the best places to work in the United States. Diversity and inclusion plays a significant role in that. So let's define what we mean by diversity and inclusion. Diversity is the condition of having or being composed of different elements, the attributes that makes each of us unique. These dimensions of diversity include age, ethnicity, gender, race, sexual orientation, educational background, economic status, marital or partner status, and the like. What is inclusion? Well, that's a pretty simple one. It's the state of being included. It's being invited. It gives us access to opportunities, gives us invitations to the right meetings, and generally, it gives us a seat at the table, or at least the belief and the optimism that we may have a seat at the table one day. At a recent firm presentation on diversity and inclusion, a speaker provided some powerful and indelible images of two very different views at a basketball game. The first was the view from the nosebleed section, the rafters. What can you learn about the game from the rafters? Well, I suppose you're at the game, but you're not close to the action. You can't study the players, their strategies, their facial expressions, their subtle communications, and their interactions with one another. You can't learn nearly as much from the rafters as you can from being courtside. And here's the view of that. Our collective priority is to give all of our people access to the courtside seats, excuse me, and all that can be learned from a closer perspective. So why promote diversity and inclusion in the construction industry? Well, in 2018, the Associated General Contractors of America released a report entitled The Business Case for Diversity and Inclusion in the Construction Industry. And that report concluded that diversity and inclusion drives success. Get this, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity are 21% more likely to have financial returns above the national industry median. And companies in the top quartile for racial and ethnic diversity are 33% more likely to have financial returns above national industry medians. As you all know, safety is the top priority or one of the top priorities in the construction industry, and inclusion drives a positive safety culture. Studies show that workers who've not been integrated into workplace culture are more likely to have accidents because of the increased psychological and emotional stress of being excluded. Exclusion affects employee productivity. An employee's productivity decreases significantly when they are excluded from contributing to the company's mission or subject to a hostile work environment. On the flip side, inclusion mitigates turnover. 65% of employees who experience exclusive behaviors said they would leave or consider leaving if they found a different job. And it drives innovation. Innovation leads to better results, performance, and profit. Alex?
Thanks, Jim. So to think about these concepts of diversity and inclusion, I think it's helpful to look at the history of diversity and inclusion. And I think it's apparent to many of us that diversity and inclusion has experienced significant growth in the past decade, particularly fueled by demographic, economic, political, and social realities and changes, and also marketplace demand and pressure. And I think even this year alone, we've seen with the protests following the death of George Floyd, that there has been significant interest or increased interest in diversity and inclusion programs at companies and organizations who are recognizing how critical matters of diversity and inclusion are to competitiveness, but also to creating a work environment that is productive and inclusive and beneficial for all employees. So from a historical context, the National Multicultural Institute provides this continuum of organizational diversity work. And it starts by identifying civil rights as kind of the bedrock of diversity and inclusion. And so these were the laws that were enacted in the 1960s, like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Equal Pay Act, and the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, that were designed to address historic discrimination and that legally denied minorities the full rights of citizenship and the opportunities that that provides. The next step that the organization identifies is affirmative action, which primarily began in the 1970s as a strategy to recruit and hire a more diverse workforce. And that focused primarily on representation and was intended to address past discrimination against underrepresented groups. The next phase is described as being managing diversity and inclusion. And so due to gains in affirmative action, organizations then began to have more diverse workplaces and workforces. But then once the representation was there, they embarked on the goal of managing diversity by tapping into the potential of all employees and to produce a more inclusive culture. So kind of to what Jim was saying about once you have a diverse group of employees present, what are the opportunities that those individuals are being provided and how are they being invested in so they can have that courtside seat as opposed to being present, but back in the nosebleed seats in the rafters. And the fourth phase is described as the diversity and inclusion as a strategic imperative. And so this is organizations that recognize diversity and inclusion as critical to their long-term business success and the success of their employees, that have adopted goals and strategic initiatives that are aligned and central to diversity and inclusion efforts. And so oftentimes this includes having a chief diversity officer who has a seat at the strategy table and can hold managers and supervisors and other decision makers to account when it relates to diversity and inclusion objectives. And to kind of go back to the bedrock that I mentioned about federal laws that were enacted to address discrimination. Just an overview for everybody at the CLE. This is a CLE, so we should talk about some law. There's Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which makes it illegal to discriminate against someone on the basis of their race, their color, their religion, their national origin, or their sex. And a number of states have complementary or similar state laws that prohibit discrimination of this sort as well. And in a number of municipalities and cities across the country, there are laws that are similar to Title VII. There's the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which makes it illegal to pay different wages to men and women if they perform equal work in the same workplace. There's the Age Discrimination Act, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967, which protects people who are over 40 years old from discrimination based on age. And then there's also the Americans with Disabilities Act, which makes it illegal to discriminate against a qualified person with a disability in the private sector and in state and local governments. And then there, of course, are state, like I mentioned, state laws, but some state laws are even broader than the federal laws enumerated above on this slide. So some states have laws that prohibit discrimination against all employees on the basis of age, not just those who are over the age of 40, or there are state laws prohibiting discrimination on the basis of marital status. So, as we think about diversity and inclusion in the construction industry, in addition to thinking about what individual policies or companies or organizations have, we should also be thinking about the applicable laws that prohibit discrimination and encourage having a diverse workforce in which employees are treated fairly, or I should say encourage and require a workplace where employees are treated fairly and lawfully, regardless of their protected characteristics or status.
So how is the construction industry doing in its efforts to promote diversity and inclusion? Well, I suppose much like the legal profession, not that great. So here are some interesting statistics from the Federal Bureau of Labor Statistics from 2019 for the construction industry. About 11 million people in that workforce, of which only 10.3% of construction professionals are females. 88.1% of professionals in the industry are white. 30.4% of workers generally are Hispanic or Latino. 6.4% are Black. That's got to be a typo there. 3.4% are Hispanic or Latino. 6.4% are Black and 1.9% are Asian. The percentage of LGBTQ construction workers remains unknown, but a recent UK study found that about 2% of the construction workforce belongs to the LGBTQ community. But incrementally, the industry is taking steps to promote diversity and inclusion. On the employer side, the AGC has launched a number of programs to enhance diversity. It plans to expand nationally a program entitled A Culture of Care that focuses on creating inclusive project sites to bring new individuals into the industry. The goal there, the primary goal, is a safe and welcoming workplace free from harassment, hazing, and bullying. And what are your industry peers doing? Well, at least 20 engineering and construction companies have signed the CEO Action for Diversity and Inclusion Pledge. The 850 plus signatory CEOs promise to create workplaces that support dialogue on difficult conversations about diversity, enhance or begin unconscious bias education, share best practices among them, and raise diversity and inclusion as a board level strategy. But as you all know, good intentions or pledges won't get your people to the courtside seats. It takes all of us.
All right, and so the next thing that we're going to talk about is the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. And this is something that I understand is of significant interest to the group of attendees at this CLE today. So by way of background, earlier this fall on September 22nd, President Trump signed an executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping that covers all federal contractors and subcontractors. And the order seeks to combat division and inefficiency in federal contracting by prohibiting contractors from providing employee training on divisive topics, which the order defines as ideas such as race or sex stereotyping or race or sex scapegoating. And so I think it's helpful if we walk through what those terms are or how those terms are defined in the executive order. So race or sex stereotyping means ascribing character traits, values, moral and ethical codes, privileges, status, or beliefs to a race or sex, or to an individual because of his race or sex. And then race or sex scapegoating means assigning fault, blame, or bias to a race or sex, or to members of a race or sex because of their race or sex. It similarly encompasses any claim that consciously or unconsciously, and by virtue of his or her race or sex, members of any race are inherently racist or are inherently inclined to oppress others, or that members of a sex are inherently sexist or inclined to oppress others. And so in defining those terms, the executive order is identifying areas of training, of diversity and inclusion training that are prohibited under the executive order. And so the order also lists several other prohibited topics or prohibited training topics. And so those include topics that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. The United States is fundamentally racist or sexist. An individual by virtue of his or her race or sex is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so that might relate to implicit bias training or unconscious bias training that some of you might be familiar with or might have undergone yourselves, or your organizations might provide training of that nature. Also prohibited is training about an individual, regarding an individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex, and that members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. And so that seems to mean training about color blindness and things of that nature would be prohibited, or discussions of color blindness in a way that falls within that description in the executive order would be prohibited. Additional prohibited training topics include an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. An individual by virtue of his or her race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. An individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. And finally, meritocracy or traits such as hard work, such as a hard work ethic, or racist or sexist, or where created by a particular race to oppress another race. And so the executive order is applicable to government contractors and subcontractors. And it very clearly provides that contracts entered into within 60 order, so that would be November 21st of 2020, need to include the language that is on the PowerPoint right now. And that language, I'm not going to bore you with reading it off of the slide right now, but I wanted to include it for attendees' reference. But the language provides that during the performance of this contract, the contractor agrees as follows. And the first bit of that language says that the contractor shall not use any workplace training that inculcates in its employees any form of race or sex stereotyping or any form of race or sex scapegoating. And we already reviewed those, the definitions of those terms earlier as they're defined in the executive order. And then the language that needs to be included in those contracts also lists each of the prohibited training topics that I just reviewed a moment ago. The required language also provides that the contractor will send a notice advising a labor union or workers representative of the contractor's commitment under the executive order. And it shall also, the contractor shall also post copies of the notice in conspicuous places available to employees and applicants for employment. Additionally, and this is the part that has a lot of government contractors really nervous and concerned, it says that in the event of the contractor's non-compliance, that could be read to say non-compliance with the executive order, so providing training on one of the divisive topics could be viewed as non-compliance or considered non-compliance. And in that event, this contract may be canceled, terminated, or suspended in whole or in part, and the contractor may be declared ineligible for future government contracts in accordance with procedures authorized in Executive Order 11246. And so that's the biggie that's of concern for a lot of government contractors, the penalty for violating the executive order. And then finally, this language says that the contractor will include the provisions of paragraphs 1 through 4 in every subcontract or purchase order unless exempted by rules, regulations, or orders of the Secretary of Labor. And so I really just wanted to flag that for all of you as this language is currently required or will be required as of November 21st, 2020. So, I mentioned the enforcement aspect of the executive order. Federal contractors who fail to abide by the requirements could be subject to enforcement action by the Department of Labor's OFCCP. Additionally, the executive order directs the OFCCP to establish a hotline and investigate complaints regarding the use of prohibited trainings. So employees who feel that they are being required to participate in trainings that could violate the executive order have the ability to call this hotline to share those concerns with the OFCCP, and there's the ability for those concerns to be investigated. And, if the executive order is fully implemented, and I say if fully implemented because there has been some litigation filed recently seeking to have a declaratory judgment entered that the executive order is unlawful and unconstitutional, and also seeking a preliminary injunction. But at any rate, if it is fully implemented, its terms could trigger significant modifications to current equity, diversity, and inclusion trainings, including how and whether certain concepts are addressed in those diversity and inclusion trainings. For example, topics such as unconscious bias, systemic racism, white privilege, male privilege, sexual harassment, and meritocracy could the treatment of those topics in trainings could be impacted by the executive order. And notably, the executive order expressly states that nothing in this order shall be construed to prohibit discussing, as part of a larger course of academic instruction, the divisive concepts referenced in the executive order in an objective manner and without endorsement. So this is one way in which, while there's not significant detail about academic instruction and what exactly that means, this is one area where perhaps there would be some additional room for talking about some of these topics if it's not in an endorsing manner. And we just had an election, and a lot of the articles that I've read about this executive order anticipate that the Biden administration will rescind the executive order. So we are in a bit of a state of limbo right now as we think about the impact of this executive order and its effect on trainings that government contractors might have provided in the past to their workforces, or that they might have planned to provide in the future. And I don't have a slide on this, but I did want to just touch briefly about kind of like what to do right now with this uncertainty. And one thing to think about is that with respect to diversity and inclusion training, there are certain requirements that, or there are training requirements that you might have, or you're still subject to equal employment opportunity laws and regulations that prohibit discrimination, that promote equal employment opportunity and affirmative action. So, thinking about how you can still conduct training that is aligned with those obligations, that does not run afoul of the executive order, is something to consider. And perhaps not scrapping training altogether on this topic, but thinking about how you can do so in compliance with the executive order. And then also evaluate the training that you do plan to provide or have provided in the past to make sure that it is compliant with the executive order, and consider modifying it to be compliant. And I think that's important too if you're engaging some sort of outside company or facilitator, to make sure that the training that they're providing is compliant with the executive order. And then, of course, if you have any questions, to seek legal counsel and advice about how to navigate this, the next couple of months as you're trying to figure out how to address the executive order, which will impose certain obligations within a matter of weeks. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Jim.
Thanks, Alex. My head's spinning listening to that executive order and contrasting that to what many of us are doing to promote diversity and inclusion, but I suppose that's a topic for a different day. What are some key aspects of an inclusion program? Well, I personally think that the most critical aspect of a diversity and inclusion initiative is the buy-in of senior management. Something like that, the letter that 850 of your CEOs in your industry signed, established diversity and inclusion as a priority, communicate it as a priority, take steps demonstrating that it is a priority. I think that's the starting place. In terms of the words and the program itself, this slide demonstrates some critical components that you should consider, including in your own policy, and many of your handbooks probably include many of these policies. And the one thing I would say there is bring them to life. And if you want the economic benefit, if you want to increase that productivity, these policies need to live more than just in the handbook that describes them. And in that regard, your policies should include a statement about equal employment opportunities and affirmative action, and should have a specific statement about inclusion. I think that many times companies, when they come to us and they want a handbook, they're just trying to check the boxes, make sure that it's legally compliant. But I would urge you and commend you to consider what that inclusion policy should say beyond simple compliance. What is it that you're trying to promote in the workplace? Put it down in black and white and bring it to life. And of course, the flip side of inclusion is exclusion. So it's critical to have a good anti-harassment policy. But again, enforcement becomes as important or more important than the mere statement of a anti-harassment policy. We need to provide reasonable accommodation to our folks, particularly those with disabilities or health conditions, so that we don't exclude those folks. We need good and generous leave policies that help us to retain our employees. Alex, to mention her, one of the most hardworking young lawyers that I know, had a baby recently and got the opportunity to spend time with her child, and in those critical first few months. Those are important. and we want to encourage folks to take advantage of those leave policies. They're good for the employer. Parental leave policies, same kind of things. Military leave, providing good benefits for employees, establishing a code of conduct. What is it that we expect of our folks, particular to inclusion and exclusion? And then how do we resolve complaints in the workplace? Are we committed to that? Do we have somebody who's got the requisite training to help resolve complaints? Do we have the requisite avenues for employees to know how do they get their complaints resolved? So let's talk for a minute about trends in diversity and inclusion generally. There's a focus now on the multi-generational workforce. Folks are staying longer in the workforce. And so we have multi-generations working together. And that creates great opportunities and great challenges at the same time. Having a greater range of experience, training, and attitudes provides a competitive advantage. We want to make sure that we're not excluding those folks that have the most experience that our young folks can benefit from, those mentor relationships. One of the critical first steps, I think, is uncovering our own biases. And again, I know this is antithetical to the executive order that Alex just described, but if we really want to promote an inclusive workplace, we need to first understand how we view the world, what our own biases are, because those affect who we choose to work with and the mentoring relationships we create. Those biases affect who we choose to go to coffee or lunch with and how we interact with others. The impact of unconscious bias in the workplace, I think, cannot be overestimated. But unless we're prodded to look at those biases, we continue on as we always have, I think, and to the detriment of our employers. And I think here just the statement of what implicit or unconscious bias is helpful. And it's the tendency to process information based on unconscious association. I can't tell you how often I've judged somebody only to spend then a few minutes talking to them about their story and getting a greater understanding of their human perspective. When I do that, the breadth of my unconscious bias is revealed to me. I see, wow, I really didn't see that person for who they are because I was viewing them through the lens of my own biases, my own life experiences. Some trends in diversity inclusion. We see a general and widespread trend towards supporting gender identity and expression. And I think your HR departments can be helpful to you in that regard. I'm not, I'm not aware of how I can best support gender identity and expression, and I need people to teach me. A focus on increasing representation of people from various backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. One exercise that we've done at our firm on occasion is simply sharing our stories. We had a meeting recently among the Latino attorneys within the firm, many of whom I've met and gotten a chance to just share superficial conversation with. But in a meeting that we had, we got a chance to hear a little bit more about one another. That changed my perspective. It grew my degree of respect and appreciation for those. And unless we hear one another's stories, I think we have very little chance of appreciating diversity and enhancing inclusion. Inclusion makes space and amplifies the voices of everyone in the workplace equally. And I know that's a lofty goal and probably unattainable. But I think when we focus on it, when we try to make space and try to hear everyone, it moves us along towards a better company, towards a more productive company. And diverse leadership is critical. Simply having folks at the lowest level, diverse employees at the lowest level, is relatively meaningless. And in fact, I think it's counterproductive. We need leadership to reflect the type of company, the diversity that we want to have. Research supports the value of diverse leadership for organizational performance and success. And I don't think we need a whole lot of research to realize when our employees are happier, when they feel included, when they feel appreciated, when they feel heard, we become more productive, our jobs get easier, our clients are happier. At least that's been my experience. And I've been told I must make this announcement, so forgive me. For New York, those in New York and Virginia who are participating and want CLE credit, we've displayed the number that you must include. It's AB 021520. That's AB 021520 for those who are on the phone. And this is being recorded as well if you need that information. So the last thing that I want to talk about is best practices. How do we get to the place we want to be? Or at least how do we start along that path towards promoting greater diversity and inclusion? And as I mentioned above, it starts with senior management. Senior management must set the tone. Senior management can, in cooperation with those who are affected, can establish their executive commitment and ownership, can identify goals and metrics. And I think it's important to talk about metrics just for a moment, because unless we have the ability to measure something, we really don't know how we're doing, whether it's our sales, our debt, or the number of folks that we have in our workplace from diverse backgrounds. We really don't know how we're doing. So I urge you to not only identify goals, but to establish the metrics that you want to use in order to evaluate how you're doing. Build a sense of belonging. My practice group leader is a guy by the name of Chris Marquardt. And when Chris took over our practice group, he had many of us read a book called Chief Joy Officer, which some of you may be familiar with. And Chris's goal in having us read that book and setting the tone for our group was to build that sense of belonging and to build that sense of ownership and to provide opportunities to our young people. Give them the belief that if they work hard, they're going to get the same opportunities that everyone else is getting. We need to educate our employees about our commitments and our goals and our belief that this is something that's good for the company. And in doing that, we need to support flexibility in the workplace. We need to revisit job requirements. We need to cast a wider recruitment net. And we have to invest in our folks, invest by training, retraining, uptraining them. So that's all that we have for today. And we welcome your questions. I'm going to turn this back to John and Debbie.
Well, first of all, Jim and Alex, thanks so much for the presentation. Thanks for sharing the updated law and the information. We do have a couple of questions that we'd like you guys to address. And I think the first one kind of relates to that point, Jim, that you made about leadership and how that really impacts the culture of diversity and inclusion. And that kind of draws me back to the executive order signed by Trump in September. Now, when you read it, it seems to be supportive of diversity and inclusion, or at least you could get confused by that. So I just want the audience to understand that it is not, which is why the Biden administration more than likely will change that. But the question is, what else do we see either from the federal government in terms of the future? What do you expect? And also at the state level, are you aware of any similar orders or efforts that really provide leadership in this area?
Yeah, thank you for that question, John. I think at the federal level, things are in such a state of flux right now that, as far as I'm aware, there's nothing as significant as this executive order that we spent a significant amount of time talking about today. But I do think, just from a kind of looking back and surveying what's going on, that the litigation over the order is pretty interesting. And the case that was recently filed in California, in that case, they're saying that the executive order violates the First Amendment and also the due process clause. And to John's point about the executive order kind of being the language kind of suggesting that it is to promote diversity and inclusion training, under the surface, it is being read to be not supportive of diversity and inclusion, and to some extent limit the type of training and the scope of the training that can be provided to employees of government contractors. And so in the California lawsuit, the plaintiffs noted, and this was just filed actually on Monday of last week, on November 2nd, but it's a lawsuit that Lambda Legal filed, and they say that all the plaintiffs, for their own employees or for the benefit of third parties, cultural competency trainings that address issues of systemic racism, sexism, anti-LGBT bias, and implicit bias are the topics that they're concerned that might be limited due to the executive order. And they say that the plaintiffs do not conduct these trainings on behalf of the government itself, but for their own employees, their clients, or the populations they serve. They receive federal funding both directly and indirectly, including through other federal contractors and grantees. The decision by plaintiffs to conduct trainings that address subjects that the executive order deems destructive or divisive constitutes protected First Amendment activity, as does their decision to acknowledge and address these issues in the provision of their services. So I think that from that, just, it's the language in a complaint, but we can see the areas where government contractors, where employers, companies, and organizations might feel like the executive order is limiting their ability to conduct the diversity and inclusion training that they've conducted in the past, or that perhaps they're interested in conducting going forward. So that's the thing that I'm most looking at right now, is this litigation, and then also to see what changes might arise with the new administration coming in January.
Thanks, Alex. So I have another question for either of you. Have you run into any clients that have had issues, HR issues, going too far in their diversity and inclusion efforts? Is that a thing now, or have you not seen that as far as client issues that have come to you?
Well, thanks, Debbie. I'll speak for myself. I have not seen diversity and inclusion efforts that go too far. I think I'm always thinking about, how am I going to protect the company at trial? If it's accused of racial bias or disability discrimination, what am I going to point to in order to humanize the company, to persuade a jury of 12 that the company is doing right by its employees, and that it really isn't a place where racial discrimination or disability discrimination or any other type is tolerated? And what I point to first are the policies. And then what I point to also are the folks that I bring up to the witness stand. If I have an African-American senior executive, which I had recently in a disability discrimination trial here in Los Angeles, he was named as a defendant, which I thought was a terrible mistake, because he was the face of the company, demonstrating the company's commitment to the opposite of discrimination. And he was a wonderful witness. And so there's benefits that transcend the economic, the joy that's created, productivity that's created. It also gives us the practical ability to defend the company when we can point to our policies and point to our efforts to promote diversity and inclusion and say, we're not who the plaintiff says we are.
Thanks, Jim. I have another question for you that dealt with distinguishing mentorship from sponsorship, particularly as it relates to diversity and inclusion. Can you expound on that a little bit?
So I can certainly talk about mentorship and what it means to me, and try and distinguish it from sponsorship. Mentorship to me is that relationship that's created in the workplace, sometimes intentionally, sometimes organically, and it just happens, where we begin working with somebody and sharing opportunities with them, giving them the opportunity to go to a trial with me. But more than that, giving them the opportunity to examine witnesses, giving them the at-bats. They're never going to hit the ball if I don't give them at-bats. It's being available to answer dumb questions. And I remember being at a mentorship program fairly recently where one of the speakers talked about the fact that mentorship, it happens in 1 and 2 minute increments. It's that interchange in the office where somebody comes by and wants to know what I'm working on, or I share what I'm working on, or I let them listen into a negotiation over the phone. It's giving them access to the knowledge that I have. It's paying it forward in a way, in the same way that the folks that mentored me gave me those opportunities. I had an early mentor by the name of Darlene Phillips, and Darlene was a construction industry and land use attorney, and she was a former college English professor. And so she bled red ink all over the papers that I would turn into her. And that didn't feel very good, but she mentored me. She took me to trial with her. She let me sit in on client discussions. She let me sit in on strategy discussions. And the next thing I knew, I was doing it myself without the training wheels. That's what mentorship is to me. I know in the UK, the UK's mentorship of young lawyers has them share an office with the more senior lawyer. No walls. They get to hear every conversation. They get to observe every interaction, every appearance. Well, that's not practical, but I think about it. Is there an opportunity that I can create for a young person to shadow me and hopefully learn a little bit something? And what I always find is I learn more in that process than I ever teach.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you, Alex. This was really enlightening, and we appreciate all of your efforts. So we are nearing the end of this session. Our next session is going to begin at 1:30, and we are actually going to have, you all may remember Jim talking about the AGC and the culture of care. So it's really exciting because we are going to have the diversity and inclusion leader for the AGC talking about her efforts to help actually, get this program off the ground, the culture of care program off the ground, and a lot of the resources that the AGC offers in the way of diversity and inclusion for construction companies. So Bryn is actually going to be leading off our next session at 1:30. And as John mentioned as well, we're going to have a highlight from a program called Construction Ready, which is really, really exciting. And I look forward to everybody hearing about them and from them. I think everybody's going to really appreciate that presentation. And I think there's going to be a real, personal aspect that hits home for the audience. So we look forward to having you all rejoin us on your second link, not the same link, but your second link at 1:30. Thank you.